The galaxy never forgot the day the oceans turned against humanity. Long before the destruction, before the storms rose like living things, people whispered about strange movements under the waves. Some said the sea felt angry, others said it felt alive, but almost no one believed the warnings, at least not until it was too late. And when the disaster finally struck, when 7 million lives were lost in a single terrifying sweep, every watching world in the galactic network paused. All eyes turned toward Earth, wondering if the humans had finally pushed their world past the point of forgiveness. It began quietly, as most tragedies do. The first signs were overlooked: unusual shifts in the tides, currents reversing for moments at a time, faint tremors on coastal sensors. Fishermen reported schools of fish behaving strangely, moving in perfect circles or staying completely still as if waiting for something. One coastal research station recorded a deep, unbroken hum from the ocean floor, so low it could barely be heard, but strong enough to make the walls vibrate. The data was filed away, marked as interesting but not urgent. People were too busy living their lives to worry about something they couldn't see. Humans always believed they understood their planet. They built ships, drilled deep into ocean floors, and filled their ports with bright lights and noise. They treated the sea as a resource, a highway, a playground, never an equal, never a presence with its own mind, memory, or limits, and certainly not something capable of anger. But Earth's oceans had been changing for years. Rising temperatures shifted ancient patterns. Coral died. Entire species vanished. Pressure pockets formed in deep trenches, and strange bioluminescent clouds drifted where no sunlight had ever touched. Scientists tried to explain it all with numbers, charts, and hopeful interviews. They didn't see the pattern forming beneath the surface, the quiet gathering of something vast and patient. The galaxies watching from afar saw it. They studied Earth like a star on the edge of collapse. Some worlds admired humanity's willpower, their stubborn hope. Others saw only recklessness, another young species pushing too hard, taking too much, ignoring the balance their own ancestors once feared. But even in all their speculation, none of them predicted what came next. The disaster began on a warm morning, the kind that made coastal cities feel peaceful, almost sleepy. Families walked along beaches, ships moved lazily through harbors, children played in shallow waves. Everything looked normal, and that might have been the cruelest part. No one realized the ocean was pulling back, inch by inch, as though taking a long breath. Birds stopped calling. Dogs barked without knowing why. The air grew strangely heavy, as if holding a warning no one could hear. When the sea finally roared forward, it came not as a single wave but as a series of violent surges unlike anything recorded in human history. Walls of water rose higher than skyscrapers, bending with impossible speed. Entire coastlines disappeared in minutes. Ships were lifted like toys and thrown inland. Roads cracked under the weight of the rushing tide. People ran without direction, desperate to escape, but the ocean was faster, stronger, and filled with a power that felt almost intentional. The galaxies watched in silence. Some species lowered their eyes, others whispered among themselves, wondering what force inside Earth could command the sea like that. Many suspected humanity had triggered it through pollution or seismic engineering. A few believed the ocean had simply reached its breaking point. But the oldest civilizations, the ones who studied worlds not just as planets but as living systems, suspected something deeper, a consciousness forming in the dark pressure of the trenches, finally rising. In the days that followed, Earth struggled to understand the scale of the loss. 7 million people gone, cities drowned, farmlands poisoned by salt, trade networks broken. The global emergency broadcasts ran non-stop, but even the most prepared nations were overwhelmed. Survivors described seeing strange glowing currents in the water, shapes that moved with purpose. Some coastal sensors captured bursts of low-frequency signals coming from miles beneath the surface, patterns too structured to be random. Governments argued over what to do. Military fleets patrolled what remained of the coastlines, though no one could explain how weapons were supposed to fight an ocean. Scientists begged for more time to research the deep-sea signals. Conspiracy networks spread wild theories that the Earth itself had awakened, and all the while, the water remained mysteriously calm, almost too calm, as if watching. The galaxy's diplomatic channels buzzed with cautious discussion. Should they intervene? Should they send aid? Should they prepare for an evacuation of humanity? Or should they step back and let Earth face the consequences of its own actions? There were no easy answers. Humanity had always been unpredictable, capable of great kindness and great destruction, sometimes in the same breath. And now they were wounded, confused, and desperate. But the strangest part was still coming. A deep-sea exploration team, one of the few still functioning, reported that an entire section of the Mariana Trench had changed shape overnight. Underwater drones sent into the area picked up a pulsing glow, almost like a heartbeat. The pressure readings fluctuated in a rhythmic pattern. At first, researchers assumed it was a malfunction, but when they rechecked the data, it remained consistent. Something massive was moving beneath the crust. Something alive. The drones sent back blurry footage before their feeds cut out. dark shapes drifting like shadows, enormous and slow, as if studying the machines. Some swore they saw an eye opening in the darkness, others believed it was just a trick of the light. The footage was immediately classified, but rumors leaked anyway. People began to panic again. Some coastal communities evacuated inland. Others simply prayed. Across the galaxy, observers leaned closer to their screens, fascinated and unnerved. Humanity had always been a species defined by struggle, by rising again and again from disaster. But this time felt different. This time the threat came from the same planet that once nourished them. And then, late one night, when most of the world slept, a new tremor shook the deep trenches. The sensors that monitored the ocean floor all triggered at once, sending alerts across every research station still standing. Something was rising again, not a wave, not a storm, but a movement deeper and more deliberate than anything recorded. The ocean was waking up, and this time it wasn't holding back. The tremor that shook the trenches that night was not the strongest Earth had ever felt, but it was the most unsettling. It didn't come with the usual rumble or shift in the crust. It didn't trigger quakes on land or send storms across the sea. Instead, it traveled like a slow pulse, pushing through the water with a rhythm that made even the senses seem nervous. Every machine tuned to the deep registered the same steady thump, as if something enormous was beating its way upward from the hidden dark. For a long moment, no one dared to speak. The researchers who were awake stared at their screens in silence, exchanging worried glances without words. Many of them had been working non-stop for days, trying to understand the earlier ocean surges, trying to figure out why so many people had been lost, trying to explain the glowing shapes that refused to match any known species. They were exhausted, shaken, and stretched thin. But even in that state, they all felt it, the sense that whatever was happening below was not done with them yet. In one isolated research vessel drifting near the Pacific Rim, a small crew gathered around the command table. The leader, a quiet person who had spent their life studying deep-sea anomalies, leaned over the screen with a tired hand pressed to their forehead. They had seen strange readings before, odd vibrations, unusual pressure shifts, but nothing that looked as intentional. They listened to the rhythmic tremor for several minutes, their eyes narrowed, then asked for the last drone feed from the trench before the machines went dark. When the footage replayed, the room fell completely silent. The glowing shapes moved slowly, drifting like massive shadows, but the most unsettling part wasn't their size. It was the way they moved, smooth, steady, perfectly coordinated, as if they were part of a single system. Some researchers whispered that the ocean currents were manipulating the shapes, or that underwater lights were interfering with the cameras. But deep down, every person in that room felt the same cold thought forming. Something down there knew what it was doing. While the researchers struggled to make sense of the data, humanity on the surface tried to rebuild. Cities that were left untouched took in displaced families. Shelters opened everywhere. Volunteers distributed food and water, and medical centers worked day and night as new arrivals poured in from ruined coastal regions. People held on to each other, grieving and frightened, but also determined to survive. Humanity had been hit before by storms, earthquakes, wars, but never like this. Never by their own world turning against them. Families gathered around radios, listening for any updates. Most news channels avoided showing footage of the disaster out of respect, but the scale of loss was impossible to hide. People spoke about the tragedy with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Some blamed climate change, others blamed underwater drilling, others feared something ancient had awakened beneath the waves. A few tried to dismiss the deep-sea signals as natural noise, but the reports kept coming. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. In the galactic network, the discussions grew louder. Some alien species argued that Earth should be placed under observation. Others believed humanity needed support before the situation worsened. A few, especially those from oceanic worlds, suggested that Earth's seas might be harboring an intelligence no one had ever recognized. But the oldest civilizations, the ones with memories stretching back thousands of years, proposed something even stranger. They asked if humanity had ever truly understood its planet at all. Across Earth, people who lived near water began noticing new oddities. Lakes rippled at unusual times. Rivers paused for seconds, as if something large passed beneath them. Coastal animals behaved unpredictably, gathering in clusters or fleeing inland without explanation. Dolphins were seen leaping in synchronized patterns that looked almost like signals. A group of fishermen near South Asia reported glowing streaks moving under their boats late at night, leaving trails of faint blue light. Rumors spread quickly online. Some said the ocean was trying to communicate. Others insisted it was preparing another attack. A few fringe groups claimed the sea was a single living entity waking after centuries of silence. Governments tried to calm the panic, releasing statements explaining the events as geological anomalies. But even the officials reading those statements struggled to believe them. One survivor, who had lost everything in the earlier surges, sat alone on the remains of a seawall, staring out at the calm water. They remembered the moment the waves rose, the thunderous roar, the impossible height of the water, the way it moved with purpose rather than chaos. They remembered seeing blue lights swirling beneath the surface just before the surge hit, as if something massive had turned over in the depths. They hadn't told anyone about that part. They weren't sure people would believe them, or if they wanted to believe it themselves. Meanwhile, the tremors continued. Not constantly, but often enough that researchers mapped them out across the globe. What they found was unsettling. The pulses seemed to come from multiple deep-sea trenches at the same time, rising and falling in a pattern that looked almost like a message. When the data was converted into audio, the sound resembled a long, echoing call, something ancient and powerful. A few scientists, unable to find any natural explanation, began to wonder if the ocean had developed some form of collective response to years of damage, not a creature, not a monster, something more like a system becoming aware of itself, something that had watched humanity drill, pollute, and reshape the waters without understanding the consequences. Humanity had been treating the sea as a background element in their world, never as a force with its own balance. And now, as the ocean stirred again, people began to realize how fragile their control had always been. Weeks passed, and the world watched, waiting. Aid teams rebuilt where they could. People tried to return to normal routines, though the fear lingered like a shadow. Every time the wind shifted or the tide rose slightly higher than usual, hearts tightened. The trauma of the disaster stayed in their minds. Then something unexpected happened. A small coastal village reported a strange formation just offshore, smooth, circular ripples that never broke apart, as though something was holding them in place. The water inside the circle was clearer than usual, glowing faintly. When researchers arrived and sent a drone into the center, the signal cut out instantly, but before it vanished, for a brief moment, the screen showed a dark vertical shape rising beneath the surface. Not a creature, not a machine, a structure, something built out of organic material, moving upward as if answering a call. The village was evacuated. More teams arrived. The galaxy watched with growing tension. No one understood what was rising, or whether it was connected to the earlier surges, or if something older had simply decided it was time to be seen. One thing was certain: the oceans were no longer silent. Something beneath the waves had awakened, and it was moving with purpose. As night fell over the village, the strange structure continued rising slowly, pulsing with dim light. The researchers kept their distance. People watched from cliffs, uncertain whether to run or stay. The air felt heavy again, the same way it had felt before the first disaster. And somewhere deep in the trench, the rhythm of the pulse changed, becoming faster, louder, closer. Humanity stood on the edge of the unknown, waiting for whatever would emerge next. The strange structure that rose offshore became the center of the world's fear almost overnight. No one could describe it clearly, because no one was allowed to get close enough. From the cliffs above the village, it looked like a tall column made of living material, smooth on some sides, ridged on others, like something grown instead of built. It pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. Every time the light inside it brightened, the water around it rippled outward in perfect spirals. People whispered that the structure was watching them, studying them, or maybe even warning them. Governments argued over what the next step should be. Some officials wanted to send in the Navy, convinced the ocean had begun forming something dangerous. Others demanded researchers be given more time, afraid that attacking the structure might provoke something worse. But most leaders simply didn't know what to do. Humanity had always fought disasters with tools, machines, and determination. But how do you confront something you don't understand, something that might be the ocean itself reacting to you? Inside a temporary command center set up near the coastline, a small team worked day and night, reviewing every piece of footage, every pressure reading, every sound captured by underwater microphones. They tried to stay calm, but the tension grew thicker with each hour. Every new reading suggested the structure was still rising, inch by inch, like it was reaching for the surface. Some team members thought it might stop on its own. Others feared it was only the beginning. One researcher who had spent years studying deep-sea ecosystems discovered a detail others had missed. The pattern of pulses from the structure matched the tremors detected across multiple trenches. It was as if all the trenches were connected, communicating, sharing one rhythm. They pointed this out, but the room fell silent, not because people didn't understand, but because they didn't want to believe it. The idea that Earth's oceans could act as one giant coordinated system was too big, too frightening. While the scientists debated, the villagers forced to leave their homes struggled in nearby shelters. Many were still shaken by the earlier disaster, and the idea of something rising from the ocean only made their fear worse. Elders in the group told stories about old legends, tales passed down for generations about the sea being alive, about creatures or spirits that guarded the deep. Younger people listened quietly, unsure whether to dismiss the stories or take comfort in them. Fear made everything feel possible. Back in the observation vessel stationed farther offshore, the crew monitored the deep with a mix of dread and curiosity. They had seen glowing shapes before. They had lost drones to the pressure, the currents, or whatever else had been moving down there. But none of them were prepared for what the sensors recorded that morning. A cluster of energy readings appeared near the trench, moving closer to the structure near the village. They shifted and twisted, forming patterns that looked almost like language, or at least like an attempt at communication. One crew member suggested sending out a series of low-frequency signals to respond, hoping the ocean might react. Another immediately protested, worried that any response could trigger another disaster. They argued quietly, but the decision was never made. Before they could send anything, the energy cluster shifted again, faster now, rising in a spiral formation. The water around the structure brightened. The crew watched in silence, unable to look away. The galaxy's observers, spread across dozens of worlds, were just as uneasy. Some species felt sympathy, remembering their own past struggles with their planets. Others doubted humanity would survive another blow. And a few, the ones who understood the deeper connections between worlds and the life within them, began to suspect the truth. Earth might not be punishing humanity. It might be trying to evolve, to change, to defend itself. But from what, or from whom? Another subplot was unfolding far away from the coast. In a landlocked city surrounded by mountains, a group of analysts had been studying global satellite images. They weren't looking at the oceans, they were looking at the land, because strangely, rivers across several continents had begun shifting their flow patterns at the same time the structure rose from the sea. Floodplains that were dry for decades had started filling with water. Underground springs awakened. Soil moisture levels increased in strange circular patches, as if water was moving beneath the earth in deliberate paths. The analysts brought their findings to their superiors, who at first dismissed the patterns as coincidence. But as more data emerged, the truth became harder to ignore. The entire water system of Earth, oceans, rivers, lakes, even underground, seemed to be reacting, not just to the disaster, to something deeper, something global, something coordinated. The world reacted with a mix of fear and fascination. Some religious groups claimed the events were a form of cleansing. Some scientists argued that Earth was experiencing a massive natural cycle that humans had never recorded before. Others insisted humanity's actions had finally triggered a global tipping point, that the oceans could no longer stabilize quietly. But among all the theories, none explained the structure rising offshore. One night, as a storm formed far out at sea, the structure pulsed faster. Waves formed around it, not violent ones, but steady, controlled movements, like the ocean was testing something. The lights inside the structure brightened, casting soft blue reflections across the cliffs. Anyone watching from the village ruins would feel the air vibrate, the same low hum recorded weeks earlier. It was rhythmic, focused, intentional. Deep in the command center, tension spiked when the sensors detected something new. Faint vibrations traveling not outward from the structure but inward, coming from multiple directions across the ocean. As if the sea were calling something to gather. Some of the researchers feared this meant more structures would rise. Some thought it was a warning. Others believed it was a signal meant for something humanity could not see. In one corner of the room, a young analyst studying wave patterns noticed something unnerving. The pulses were aligning with underwater currents, forming pathways as if guiding movement toward the structure. They pointed this out, their voice shaking slightly. The room turned quiet again. No one wanted to admit it, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. The ocean was organizing itself. On the observation vessel, the crew felt the change too. The water around them grew warmer, then cooler, shifting in waves that didn't match the wind or surface temperature. The glowing shapes reappeared beneath their ship, drifting quietly, like guardians watching the surface. One crew member leaned against the rail, staring at the glowing patterns. They whispered something no one wanted to say out loud, that maybe the ocean wasn't attacking humanity at all. Maybe it was preparing for something else, something bigger, something deeper than anyone understood. But they didn't get to finish that thought. The structure suddenly released a pulse so strong it shook the cliffs and rattled every sensor in the region. Lights flickered, waves crashed against the shore, birds scattered into the night sky. The pulse continued in steady, powerful beats, louder, stronger, faster. Something was coming, something rising, something the ocean had been preparing for since the first tremor. And humanity, watching from the fragile edge of their world, could only wait as the water began to glow once more. The pulse from the rising structure didn't fade. It grew stronger, pushing through the air like a heartbeat the size of the world. People felt it in their chests, in their teeth, even in the ground beneath them. The command center's monitors flickered in perfect time with the rhythm. On the cliffs, the abandoned village trembled as the waves below formed patterns that were too clean, too controlled, too measured to be natural. Every ripple moved with purpose. Far offshore, the research vessel's crew watched the glowing forms beneath the water reorganize, drifting into a perfect circle beneath their ship. No one said a word. The sea was no longer just reacting, it was preparing. And deep below the glowing shapes, something huge moved, slow, steady, coming upward. On the galactic network, every watching world had stopped whatever they were doing. News feeds that once showed casual updates now covered only Earth. Ships from other civilizations stayed at a distance, uncertain whether approaching would help or provoke the oceans further. Even the oldest species, those who had seen planets evolve, die, and transform, couldn't agree on what was happening. Some believed Earth had entered the early stages of planetary consciousness. Others thought something ancient had awakened. Others feared an external force had triggered the oceans into defense mode. But none of them could deny that Earth was doing something no one had seen before. Across Earth, the tension built like pressure before a storm. Rivers continued shifting, lakes rose and fell as if breathing. Underground water channels moved in ways geologists couldn't explain, and the global ocean currents began forming long, winding paths that connected distant coastlines with strange precision. It was as if the entire planet's water system had become one mind, one living network, flowing with a shared intention. In the mountain city, the analysts watching satellite data finally understood the scale of the change. The water pathways weren't random, they were forming a global pattern, a spiral stretching across continents and oceans. The formation pointed directly toward the structure rising near the village. It wasn't just a pillar. It was an anchor, a focal point, a gathering point. But for what? Back near the coast, the command center's atmosphere changed from confusion to alarm as more sensors triggered. Dozens of underwater anomalies appeared across the Pacific. Rising heat signatures, shifting currents, pressure spikes, and strange magnetic readings that crossed paths with the glowing shapes they'd seen before. One researcher zoomed in on a new reading from the trench. The signal was faint but growing quickly. When they enhanced the image, the room fell silent. A massive silhouette was rising from the deepest point of the ocean, too large to be a creature, too fluid to be a structure, too alive to be anything made by human hands. It moved like a continent deciding to swim. The researchers stepped back from the screen, their breath catching. It wasn't just the size, it was the shape, ever-changing, spiraling, folding into itself like a giant living current. The instant they tried to speak, the data spiked again, almost violently. The silhouette accelerated. The ocean's heartbeat grew louder. The villagers sheltering inland felt the vibrations even from miles away. Children covered their ears. Adults exchanged fearful glances they tried to hide. Phones buzzed with fresh warnings telling people to move farther inland. Evacuation roads jammed. Rumors spread faster than official updates. Some believed another massive surge was coming. Others whispered that the ocean was about to rise in full. Back on the research vessel, the crew braced themselves as the glowing circle below tightened. The water around them became unnaturally still, the air heavy with moisture. No wind, no waves, only the slow rising hum that felt like the breath of something enormous beneath the surface. One crew member leaned over the rail, whispering it's waiting. No one disagreed. The structure near the village reached its highest point, towering above the surface like a column grown from the seabed. The glowing inside intensified until it shone bright enough to cast shadows across the cliffs. The pulses came faster now, no longer slow and steady, but urgent, like a call being answered. The ground trembled, the ocean stirred. And then, the water around the structure began to sink not downward, but inward, pulled toward the base of the column as if a massive force were drawing it in. The ocean wasn't rising anymore. It was retreating, bending toward the anchor. The command center erupted in alarms. The automated voice struggled to keep up with the rapid spikes in readings, pressure levels, heat signatures, magnetic lines. Everything jumped into extreme ranges all at once. The ocean wasn't behaving like water anymore. It was moving like a single vast organism shifting its weight, and it was all focusing on one point, the anchor. Humanity wasn't just facing another disaster. They were standing at the edge of something transformative, something planet-wide, something possibly irreversible. A final tremor shook the entire coastline. Windows rattled, loose objects fell, car alarms screamed across the valley. Then, from miles offshore, the deep rumble grew louder and closer until it became impossible to ignore. The silhouette in the trench had reached the mid-depth layers. It was rising faster now, moving with the same rhythm as the pulses from the structure. Every glowing shape beneath the research vessel suddenly descended, spiraling downward in perfect sync as if guiding or welcoming what approached. Then the water exploded upward, not in a destructive blast, but in a massive column of swirling blue lights stretching toward the sky. The crew shielded their eyes. The villagers screamed. Even the sensors in the command center glitched, unable to process the sudden burst of energy. Something was coming through that column. Something alive, something powerful. Across the galaxy, every observer leaned closer to their screens. Some froze, some trembled. A few whispered ancient warnings remembered from old stories about worlds that spoke through their oceans. As the column of light narrowed and condensed, a shape emerged at the center, huge, shifting, impossible to fully see. It was like looking at a storm given form or a current turned into flesh. It rose higher and higher, shedding the last of the deep-sea darkness like a second skin. The anchor's glow reached its brightest point. The ocean's pulse reached its fastest rhythm, and the rising shape released a sound, not a roar, not a scream, but a deep, resonant call that shook the cliffs, the vessels, the skies, and even the watching worlds. It wasn't a sound of anger. It wasn't even a sound of warning. It was a sound of arrival. Whatever the ocean had been preparing for, it was here. And humanity stood on the brink of knowing exactly what had been waiting in the deep, ready or not. The sound that rose from the glowing column echoed across the coast, rolling through the cliffs like a slow, shaking breath. But before anyone could even process its meaning, the light shifted. What had been a bright, steady glow suddenly fractured into thin, sharp strands that streamed outward in every direction, like the ocean was sending signals across the world. The researchers in the command center stared at the monitors as glowing lines appeared on global maps, stretching across seas, crossing continents, and vanishing into deep inland regions. It was as if the oceans were activating something far beyond the coast. At first, everyone assumed the signals were only traveling through water, but then reports started coming in from landlocked regions, places with no rivers, no lakes, no visible connection to the sea. Seismic sensors detected faint pulses beneath deserts, mountain ranges, and old dried-out basins. Underground water reserves began to tremble. Wells overflowed, springs burst open after decades of silence. Something under the earth was answering the call. In the mountain city, the analysts who'd been tracking global water patterns watched in disbelief as entire sections of the planet lit up with matching signals, forming a pattern that didn't just stretch across the world, it spiraled around it. The formation didn't look random at all. It looked like a design, a blueprint, a global system waking up piece by piece. Back at the coast, the towering shape rising from the deep shifted again, its edges flickering like it was struggling to hold form. For a moment, the glowing light around it dimmed, as if reacting to something unexpected. The structure, the anchor, shook violently, sending ripples outward that rocked the cliffs and nearly knocked the research crew off their feet. The pulse, once steady and confident, suddenly faltered. Something was wrong. The oceans had been calling, reaching out, activating, gathering, but now they seemed to hesitate, almost like they felt another presence pushing back. A second force, a second will. The cliffside trembled once more, sharper this time. The water around the anchor rose suddenly, forming a massive ring that spun faster and faster until the surface became a swirling vortex of light. Researchers stared, confused. This wasn't part of the earlier patterns. This wasn't careful or controlled. It was chaotic. And then a new signal blasted through the global network, a sharp, piercing frequency that cut through all the other pulses. The crew on the vessel clamped their hands over their ears. The command center's screens flickered violently. Sensors overloaded. The anchor's glow cracked like glass under pressure. It wasn't the ocean calling this time. Something else was answering. Somewhere in the deep, far below the rising shape, a second silhouette appeared, darker, sharper, moving against the ocean's rhythm instead of with it. The glowing forms that once drifted peacefully now scattered in panic. The light in the water dimmed. The ocean's pulse weakened. The first entity rising from the trench had not come alone, and the ocean, once united and powerful, was suddenly no longer sure which force it had awakened. Far above, humanity watched the water turn dark and violent beneath a vast glowing pillar as two ancient forces shifted beneath the surface, their conflict rising toward the world that had unknowingly triggered both. The ocean churned with a force that shook the entire coastline. What had started as a single rising presence from the deep was now locked in a violent struggle with the darker silhouette below it. The glowing shapes that once floated calmly scattered like startled birds, their light flickering across the water. The anchor, the towering column pulsing above the waves, strained against the pull of both forces, its glow cracking as if it could barely hold the world's water system together. The coastal cliffs groaned. The research vessel fought to stay afloat. Humanity watched helplessly as the two ancient powers battled beneath the surface. The ocean's pulse faltered again, wavering like a heartbeat on the edge of collapse. Then, without warning, the rising shapes surged upward with a burst of blue light that cut through the dark waters. The column responded instantly, sending beams of energy into the depths. The darker presence recoiled, twisting violently, distorting the water around it. For a moment, the sea split into two swirling halves, one bright, one shadowed, spiraling around each other in a massive clash of currents. The command center's monitors stabilized just long enough to show the truth. The brighter force was the ocean's collective defense, an ancient system awakened to protect the planet. The dark force was not part of Earth at all. It had been hiding, dormant, waiting in the deepest part of the trench, something foreign, something that had fed on pressure and silence, something the world had never known existed. Humanity had awakened both. The brighter force pushed upward with everything it had, rising through the vortex, drawing strength from every ocean trench and underground channel that had come to life. The darker force resisted, pulling downward in a desperate attempt to drag the planet's water system back into the abyss. For a breathless moment, it seemed the dark presence might succeed. But the ocean wasn't alone. Across the world, every activated water source responded. Rivers surged. Springs burst open. Underground reservoirs pulsed in sync. Cities heard the humming again. The same call that had started everything, but this time stronger, unified, focused. The planet's entire water network rose like a single voice. The lighter force expanded, releasing a wave of blue light that illuminated the clouds. The dark presence shrieked, silent but felt and shattered, breaking apart into streams of fading shadow. The sea swallowed the remnants, pulling them down into the trench where the glow from the brighter force sealed it shut. The vortex calmed, the anchor dimmed, the pulse steadied. The ocean exhaled. Humanity watched as the towering column slowly sank back into the sea, its work complete. The glowing shapes drifted upward one last time, circling the research vessel before dissolving into the waves like sparks fading in the wind. The crisis was over. The ocean grew quiet, but just as the world released its breath, a final tremor whispered through the deep, too soft for most to notice, but strong enough to leave a faint ripple on every shoreline. The command center captured the last signal seconds before it vanished. A small, deliberate pulse coming not from the trench, but from somewhere far beneath Earth's crust. Something else had heard the battle. Something older, something waiting. The oceans had won this fight. But the planet had just revealed its first secret. In the days that followed, the ocean settled into an unfamiliar calm. Waves moved with a slower rhythm, almost thoughtful, as if the planet itself was taking a long breath after surviving something it had never prepared for. The global water patterns that once spiraled across continents slowly faded back into their natural currents. Rivers reclaimed their normal paths. Springs quieted, wells stopped overflowing, but even in this return to balance, the world felt changed. As though everyone understood they had witnessed something far bigger than a natural disaster. The command center became a place of quiet reflection rather than panic. Researchers studied the last signals captured from the trenches, trying to understand what exactly had awakened and what had been defeated. They pieced together the truth. Earth's water system had acted as a defense mechanism, something ancient and instinctive, rising to protect the planet from a foreign presence that had been hiding deeper than any instrument had ever reached. The glowing shapes, those drifting guardians, were likely manifestations of that defensive consciousness, temporary forms created by the planet itself. The research vessel returned to shore, battered but intact. Its crew reported everything they had seen: the rising light, the spiraling currents, the final clash beneath the waves. People across the world listened with a mix of awe and fear. It was clear now that humanity had never really understood its own planet. All the drilling, mining, pollution, and reshaping had been done with the belief that Earth was a passive world. But now they knew the truth. The planet was not fragile. It was not silent. It was alive in ways no one had imagined. Communities near the coast slowly returned home. They rebuilt houses, cleaned debris, and planted new gardens. The village near the anchor site became a place of remembrance. People gathered there every evening to watch the calm water and talk about those they lost. But there was also a strange comfort in knowing the ocean had protected them from something far worse. Children who once feared the waves now sat by the shore, listening to the soft hum that sometimes lingered at dusk, the same hum the senses had once captured, but now gentle, almost like a lullaby. Across the galaxy, observers updated their records. Earth was no longer seen as a reckless young world, but as a planet with hidden depths, a world capable of defending itself in ways no one expected. Some civilizations reached out with offers of assistance, while others simply watched with a newfound respect. Humanity, for the first time, understood that it was part of something larger, not just a species living on a planet, but a partner living with one. And yet, one question lingered. The final faint pulse detected after the climax, the whisper beneath the crust, remained unexplained. Some scientists dismissed it as an echo, a delayed vibration from the battle. Others believed it was a sign that Earth held more mysteries waiting in the deep. But most people chose not to worry. They had survived the worst. They had seen the ocean rise, defend, and return to peace. Life eventually resumed. Cities reopened, markets filled, children played. Humanity carried on, not unchanged, but wiser. They treated the oceans with more care. They monitored the trenches respectfully, and they really listened to the planet they'd taken for granted. The world had revealed one of its secrets, and maybe someday it would reveal more. But for now, the water was calm, the skies were clear, and humanity had earned another chance to live in balance with the place they called home. And the planet, alive beneath their feet, seemed content to rest.